Imagine waking up in a freezing one-room cabin. There's snow blowing in through the cracks in the wall. The baby's crying. The roof is leaking. You haven't eaten since yesterday because the bread turned rock hard overnight and the beans are frozen solid. Before breakfast, you'll need to chop firewood, haul water from a frozen creek, milk a very angry cow, and, just for fun, deliver your neighbor's baby. Welcome to the daily life of a frontier woman. Tonight we're stepping into her boots. No Wi-Fi, no lattes, and no backup plan. Just you, a skillet, a blizzard, and about 300 things to do before sundown. We'll explore what survival really looked like on the frontier, and why most of us wouldn't have made it past the first week or the first morning. If you value these quiet moments of history, consider supporting this space by liking or subscribing, but only if it feels right to you. It helps keep the stories flowing. There's something comforting about knowing who's out there, listening in the stillness. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you there. Now, lower the lights, allow your breath to slow, and let the quiet settle in. The winds on the frontier didn't care much for poetry, but if they had, they might have told the real story, not of sheriffs and six-shooters, but of women trudging across hard ground, sleeves rolled, arms sunburnt, doing the work that built towns while someone else took the credit. They were the unseen trailblazers, not so much walking the paths already made, but stitching new ones with bootlaces and bone-deep patience. Sure, the history books called it a man's world, but women were out there with grit in their teeth and calluses on their souls, planting roots, while men chased gold or glory, and sometimes both, unsuccessfully. When you think of pioneers, you might picture a bearded man with a musket and a questionable diet. But real pioneering often looked more like Margaret, who baked bread, birthed children, buried dreams, and somehow taught herself how to read, mostly by candlelight and sheer defiance. Or Winona, who stitched moccasins from buffalo hide and taught her grandchildren which plants healed and which ones made you dream of talking coyotes. There were those who took up the plow, or the ledger, or the rifle, sometimes all in the same day. Women ran boarding houses that served as post offices, jails, and emergency clinics. They pulled teeth with pliers. They stitched wounds with thread, usually meant for hemming trousers. You had to make do. And if you couldn't make do, you made different. At a time when womanly virtues were supposed to include embroidery and fainting gracefully, frontier women were guiding oxen through rivers and dragging carts out of the mud because nobody else could. And strange as it sounds now, the West offered them a rare kind of freedom. Expectations were lighter when survival was daily, and mud was ankle deep. Nobody cared if your petticoat was properly starched when the chickens were sick and the water barrel needed mending. Of course, not everyone got the same version of freedom. Black women, indigenous women, and women of Mexican descent often faced the brutal arithmetic of prejudice plus labor equals invisibility. They were housekeepers, cooks, nannies, and washerwomen, the backbone behind the backbone. And yet, they also built their own lives, their own communities. Take Bridget Mason, a formerly enslaved woman who walked to California behind a wagon train, helped deliver babies along the way, won her own freedom in court, and became one of Los Angeles's first real estate moguls. Then there were the spiritual warriors, the ones with a prayer in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Preacher women who led lonely congregations in towns where the church doubled as a schoolhouse and tripled as a dance hall. Women who couldn't vote, yet served as community glue, teaching, nursing, feeding, remembering. They saved generations without ever being called heroes, unless you count baked goods and healed fevers as medals, which honestly we should. And let's not forget the women with actual rifles. There's always been debate about how many truly fought in skirmishes or ambushes. Some say dozens, others say hundreds. But nobody argues that they knew how to shoot, and they had good reason. The West wasn't polite. Wild animals, wild men, and even wilder politics made it pretty clear that self-defense was not only allowed, it was encouraged by necessity. One disputed tale that still circles dusty campfires is about a woman known only as Coyote Sue. According to scattered and suspiciously poetic accounts, she led a small band of settlers through hostile territory after their male guide got distracted by gold fever and left. Did she really stare down bandits with nothing but a shovel and a soup ladle? Unconfirmed. But the West didn't really need facts. It needed legends. And women were quietly excellent at both. Settling didn't always mean conquest either. Many women, especially indigenous matriarchs, tried to hold space, not for expansion, but for continuity. Among the Hopi, for example, women traditionally owned the homes and passed down the family line. So while white settlers were busy dividing land on legal maps, Native women were working to protect ancient knowledge, migrating with memory instead of fences. There's a quiet fire in the stories of women who came west not for adventure or fame, but because life demanded it. They were pulled by hope or heartbreak, or the sheer mathematics of poverty. So they packed what they could, lace, lye, soap, maybe a Bible, and stepped into a landscape that didn't care how ladylike you were. It only cared whether you could survive a dust storm and still make dinner. And somehow, they did. They raised children in sod houses, negotiated with railroad men, traded recipes over barbed wire fences, and held funerals with no pastors around. They sang lullabies to the wind and wrote letters home that started with, "Dear sister, the hens are molting again." The Western woman was not one kind of woman. She was blacksmith's wife and blacksmith herself. She was former enslaved, freeman's daughter, indigenous wisdom keeper, homestead queen, laundress, outlaw, healer, gambler, teacher, preacher, widow, midwife. Some were famous, most were not. But all of them left marks that didn't show up on maps. Even now, when you drive past an empty farmhouse with boards over the windows, it's easy to forget that someone once rebuilt that roof 3 times before giving up. That a woman once stood in that doorway with 2 babies on her hip, trying to decide whether to pray for rain or just go fetch the watering can again. And somewhere in the layers of forgotten dust, beneath the faded wallpaper and cracked dishes, are echoes of laughter, of hymns sung off key, of stories told over coffee boiled too long. They're not the trailblazers you see in bronze by the courthouse, but they're the ones who lit the lanterns and refilled the wagon wheels. Quietly, absolutely not softly. So the next time you hear that the West was tamed by men, just remember, those men might have built the fences, but women often hammered the nails, fixed the cracks, and remembered where the gate key was buried. The journey west began not with grand proclamations or duels at high noon, but with packing lists. Long ones, drafted slowly at kitchen tables while a pot simmered and the baby cried, and someone's brother-in-law swore the Oregon Trail was just a long walk with the scenic route. It was a peculiar ritual, half practical, half romantic. Every item had to justify its weight, measured not only in pounds, but in potential. Corsets, for example, rarely made the cut. Out on the prairie, nobody had time for 27 metal eyelets and a daily battle with breath. So off they came, sometimes tucked quietly into trunks for Sunday respectability, sometimes burned just for the thrill of rebellion. In their place came calico skirts wide enough for striding, aprons built for survival, and boots that could square off with a rattler and live to tell the tale. The wagons didn't look like Hollywood props. They were creaky, canvas-topped boxes on wheels that bumped like a rowboat in choppy seas, and into them went iron skillets, blackened already from years of bacon and biscuits, alongside quilts sewn from dresses that no longer fit or belonged to someone already under a gravestone back east. They packed seeds, letters, Bibles, dried apples, hairbrushes, and sometimes a single porcelain doll with a face too fragile for the road, but too loved to leave behind. Every pound mattered, every object a bet against the unknown. Salt or sugar, rope or ribbon. Bring the rocking chair and you might have to leave behind your mother's clock. Some women tried to smuggle in keepsakes and were betrayed by the telltale tinkle of broken china 2 days into the trip. The wilderness had no mercy for heirlooms. People think adventure starts when you hit the trail. But really, it starts when you realize you have to choose between bringing your third frying pan or your daughter's wedding dress. And you know you'll need both. But the oxen are only so forgiving. There was, of course, dreaming involved. These weren't just wagons. They were vessels of escape for women who'd been told how to walk, how to speak, and whom to marry. For every woman who left her town with a husband and 3 children, there was another who left behind a husband and reinvented herself halfway through Missouri. The frontier didn't ask about your past. It only wanted to see what you did when the axle broke or the river rose fast. Sometimes they packed more than they needed, out of hope or habit, or just an inability to picture a future where cheese graters didn't matter. Other times, they packed too little and found themselves bartering shirts for a spare tin cup in the middle of nowhere. Resourcefulness was not optional. It was currency. Women sewed harnesses out of petticoats, made poultices from wild onions, and turned wagon covers into tents when storms rolled in with more drama than a soap opera season finale. And heaven help you if you lost a button. A single missing fastener could derail an entire outfit, and therefore an entire day. Buttons were hoarded like gold, stitched back with tight, suspicious fingers over the firelight. If you dropped one in the dust, it became a cautionary tale. Remember Cousin Millie? Never found that button. Wore her coat open for 6 weeks, froze a bit, lost a glove. Tragic. The fact that some of these travelers were teenagers or younger still astonishes modern sensibilities. Imagine being 14 and not just surviving puberty, but also mending a ripped wheel cover while cooking over buffalo chips, which, yes, are exactly what they sound like. There were no scented candles for comfort, only determination, smoke, and the occasional sarcastic comment about how nobody ever packed enough coffee. One mainstream fact that surprises people now: Julia Archibald Holmes hiked Pikes Peak in 1858, wearing bloomers, and scandalized polite society by doing so unchaperoned. She called it a walk of pleasure. Others called it unladylike, which, coming from people who'd never hiked 14,000 feet, felt a bit rich. A more debated point, whether pioneer women actually sat on the wagons during the journey or walked beside them. Hollywood favors the image of bonneted figures perched daintily on benches. But diaries tell a different story. Lots of walking, lots. In fact, many women trudged for thousands of miles in shoes that would now be marketed as rustic leather torture socks. Some historians argue they walked to save wear on the oxen. Others think it was just that bumpy up there. Those wagons could carry about 2,000 pounds before the axles wept from strain, so decisions had to be made. A piano? Absolutely not. A washboard? Maybe. A barrel of pickled cabbage? Depends on your commitment to digestion. And even with careful planning, unpleasant surprises lurked. Rains could spoil flour. Rats could chew through blankets. And always, there were the mountains, stubborn, huge, and unimpressed by your cast-iron Dutch oven. Still, hope weighed more than any skillet. It was tucked into embroidery hoops and lullabies, folded into letters home that read, "We are well," even when they were not. It showed in the way a woman smoothed her child's hair at dusk, or how she baked biscuits from nothing but flour, baking soda, and sheer nerve. Years later, they would be remembered not for what they packed, but for what they carried inside them, the grit, the humor, the adaptability. These were not fainting heroines. These were women who could drive oxen, deliver babies by lamplight, and still make coffee strong enough to revive a man halfway through dysentery. So the next time you hesitate over packing for a weekend trip, trying to fit your electric toothbrush, wireless earbuds, and 3 kinds of shampoo into a carry-on, think of her. The woman who once held up a bonnet to the prairie wind, squinted westward through the dust and said, "Well then, let's see what happens next." The prairie wind never stopped. It didn't knock politely or choose one house over another. It just blew, relentless and hollow, like a ghost trying to find something it lost. And against that wind, families survived inside square boxes, dug partway into the earth and topped with sod houses, little homes made of dirt and grass, stacked like meatloaf bricks, smelling of damp soil long after a rain. Cozy, if your idea of cozy includes sharing your kitchen with a few beetles and the occasional snake. Inside, the walls crumbled slowly, shedding a bit of your living room every time the wind howled too hard. But the women, the prairie mothers, they held it all together. With one hand stirring a pot and the other swatting flies, they ran these tiny fortresses like generals wearing aprons. Dust settled into every crack, into hair, into lungs. It was said you could sweep the floor, turn around, and start again. More of a suggestion than a chore. Water was drawn by the bucket. Heat came from buffalo chips or whatever you could scavenge. And light flickered from kerosene lamps barely bright enough to read a Bible verse. Still, they raised children, often a small herd of them, in these earthen cabins. From birth to burial, babies arrived in thunder and silence, often miles from any doctor, miles from help. A woman might give birth in the morning and cook dinner that evening. No one was going to cover her shift. Loneliness pressed closer than the wind. On the open plains, the horizon stretched so wide it could steal your sense of size, of time, of self. A neighbor might be 5 miles away, close by prairie standards, but in snow or illness that might as well have been the moon. So women wrote letters. They poured their longing into ink and sent it eastward with hope and stamps. Some stitched their feelings into quilts, each square a silent prayer or secret. Others went quiet. You'd have to listen carefully to notice when a voice began to shrink. Children didn't always live long enough to grow loud. Disease arrived quicker than the traveling preacher. Diphtheria, typhoid, even a fever. These could take a child in a day, sometimes two. And just like that, a mother would build a pine box with her husband, if he was still alive or hadn't gone to fetch a neighbor. They'd dig a hole behind the house or near the cottonwoods, wrap the child in the softest thing they had, and press their grief into the earth. No stone usually, just memory. It was said prairie women aged before their time. Their hands bore calluses that told better stories than most newspapers. Their backs bent under the weight of corn, of laundry, of everything unspoken. These women weren't weak. They couldn't afford to be. Resilience wasn't inspirational, it was oxygen. They patched roofs and birthed babies and taught children to read from Bibles with missing pages. They made coffee from corn and turned flour sacks into dresses. And yes, that's a real thing. Grain companies actually began making sacks in floral prints because women, nationwide, were like, if I have to wear wheat, it might as well be cute. The sod house may not have had a parlor or a porch swing, but the hearth was sacred. Meals were not just nourishment, they were sanity. The smell of bread could bring comfort stronger than any sermon. And sure, maybe that bread had a little extra grit in it. Sifting flour was an optional luxury. But it was warm and shared, and it meant you were still trying. Even holidays were redefined. Christmas might bring an apple or a tin cup, maybe a rag doll sewn late at night by candlelight, its hair made from spare yarn and love. Birthdays were sometimes marked with a special chore left undone, or an extra spoonful of sugar in your porridge. Magic had to be invented. There's a famous photo of a prairie woman standing outside her sod house, a baby on her hip, and 3 chickens in the background, somehow looking both exhausted and immortal. You can see every wind-blown thought in her face. That's the mainstream history most folks know, the visual shorthand for frontier motherhood. But what you don't see is the loss behind her eyes, or the scrap of poetry she copied into a notebook hidden beneath the bed, or the way she ran out to call her children inside during a dust storm, shouting their names into a sky that didn't always answer back. Some historians argue that prairie life united men and women more as equals. Survival left little room for dainty Victorian roles. Others say the stubborn grip of patriarchal norms still clung to the prairie like burrs in a skirt hem. Both might be true depending on whose cabin you walked into. What isn't debated? That women kept the West turning even when the wind tried to grind it to dust. Sundays, if there was time, a mother might sit with her girls and teach them how to hem, how to cross-stitch a sampler, how to stand still while the wind rushed past their dresses. She taught them how to read a sky for thunder, how to tell if the cow was sick, how to listen for silence that meant trouble, not peace. The art of survival wasn't written, but it was passed down nonetheless. And these women, they rarely saw themselves as heroes. They didn't write manifestos or seek statues, but they built a world with their hands. When you think of the Wild West, you might picture a gunslinger or a golden canyon. But you should also picture a woman kneeling in the dirt, planting corn with one hand and holding a child with the other. She's not wearing boots with spurs or carrying a Winchester rifle, but if you asked her to, she probably could. Her sod home might dissolve in a few decades, pulled apart by rain and cattle and time. But the echo of her life lingers in a country's backbone, in its recipes, in the humor of someone who's been through worse and still likes to laugh, and in every tired parent who manages to cook dinner, wipe a nose, and fix a broken hinge before bedtime. The frontier just called it Tuesday. Pearl's silhouette dissolves into the prairie grass, and just like that, the wind draws quiet again, curling around hills that have seen more sorrow than gold, more dust than justice. But while stagecoach robbers and saloon rebels make the dime novels, we drift now to women whose stories rarely found paper. Long before barbed wire, or the word frontier existed, the land had already been spoken for by voices older than maps. Women of the Cheyenne, the Lakota Sioux, the Apache, and so many others. Daughters of this place, not visitors to it. Their roots ran deeper than any settler's fence post. And when westward expansion came barreling in like a drunk on a stolen horse, it wasn't opportunity that came knocking, it was catastrophe. Imagine living in a world where your calendar is the moon, your geography a memory passed through songs, where stories aren't just entertainment, but coordinates for survival. And then, in the span of a generation gone, buffalo vanish, rivers renamed, and suddenly, the horizon isn't promise but exile. Many Native women became the keepers of what could still be carried, the ones who remembered which plants healed and which fed, who whispered stories to children after yet another forced march. They taught the songs, even when they had to be sung in hiding. They turned spoken language into a shield against forgetting. And they resisted, not always with rifles, though yes, some of them were very handy with those too, but with persistence so quiet it roared. Take Sarah Winnemucca, a Paiute woman who, in the late 1800s, did something truly wild for her time. She wrote a book. And not just a diary or a collection of letters, a political memoir. She traveled to Washington, spoke before Congress, and said essentially, "You keep telling me your laws protect people." What people exactly? Cue the sound of monocles hitting marble floors. Sarah wasn't just speaking for herself. She was trying to save her community from broken treaties, forced removals, and the soul-grinding erasure of identity through government boarding schools. And although her words reached the ears of powerful men in polished shoes, the real power of her actions lay in what she preserved: dignity, memory, hope. And then there's Sacagawea. Everyone knows her as the teenage guide who helped Lewis and Clark make it from Missouri to the Pacific without dying of poor choices, which honestly was a minor miracle, but history compresses people. It turns a Shoshone woman who bore a baby mid-expedition and still managed to navigate literal uncharted wilderness into a token footnote, or worse, a mascot. But Sacagawea wasn't just guiding geography, she was guiding diplomacy. Her presence signaled peace to tribes along the way. A woman with an infant in tow isn't exactly the image of a war party. And yet, she was also a translator, a negotiator, an anchor of calm in a group of men who thought eating candles was an appropriate survival strategy. They did actually try that. Spoiler, it did not work. Meanwhile, as armies pushed outward and buffalo herds dried up, Native women relocated not just their homes, but their minds. They hid sacred objects beneath their skirts. They taught prayers under the guise of lullabies. They baked bread that carried the taste of homelands hundreds of miles away. Some became nurses, translators, or farm workers. Roles forced upon them, yes, but also roles they hollowed out and filled with resistance. Every time they kept a child from forgetting their language, resistance. Every time they rewove a traditional basket in a place that hated the tradition, resistance. Historians often argue over whether certain Native heroines collaborated with white government agents or resisted them, especially in the case of Sarah Winnemucca. It's the kind of debate that happens far away from the smell of burnt sage or the sound of old lullabies. Real life doesn't follow clean categories. These women survived in impossible positions, doing what they could with what they had. And that's not a contradiction. That's a legacy. The forced relocations, the reservations, the annihilation of the buffalo, they weren't just political moves. They were intimate disasters. They tore apart meals, marriages, medicine. And women bore the brunt of that, not just in labor, but in lineage. It was their job, somehow, to keep the thread from snapping. So when we talk about women of the West, let's not mistake adventure for glory. For many Native women, the West wasn't a frontier. It was home, turned battlefield, turned graveyard, and still they sang. Can you hear it? The hum of a cradleboard gently rocked, the scrape of stone against hide, shaping tools for a future still possible. The hush of moccasins, not sneaking, just surviving. These were women who, even after being pushed to the margins, still braided corn, still held winter count stories in their palms, still taught daughters how to listen to wind. Today, we name highways and schools after the generals. But out there, beyond the noise, the land still remembers the ones who healed it. And when that prairie wind catches just right, curling past the cottonwoods and over the ghost trails, you may not see them, but somewhere out there, the daughters are still singing. Boomtowns smelled like wet sawdust, spilled whiskey and cowboy sweat. And if that doesn't sound like the best place to start an empire, well, you're probably correct. But for the women who arrived in these roaring settlements where wood was still drying on the buildings and lawmen clocked out at dusk, opportunity didn't just knock. It danced, flirted, and sometimes kicked down the saloon doors in a feathered corset. These towns popped up like mushrooms after a thunderstorm. Mining camps turned into tent cities, turned into rowdy, unpredictable fiefdoms of mud and gold. And while men came chasing silver veins or striking oil, women came too. Some followed husbands, some ran from them, and some, like Maddie Silks and Dora Dufran, came to run things. Now, it's easy to imagine the Wild West as a blur of saloons, gunfights, and men named Buck or Slim, but the real action often took place upstairs or behind velvet curtains, where women didn't just perform, they capitalized. Maddie Silks was nothing if not determined. Born in the Midwest, she made her way westward in her 20s. And by the time she hit Denver, she had already elevated herself from working girl to madam. That's a title with more grit than glamour. A madam wasn't just a boss. She was a financier, a property owner, a negotiator, and occasionally a punching bag for local politics. Maddie owned multiple brothels, managed a rotating staff of women, handled licensing, and paid off whoever needed paying off. Denver society wrinkled its nose at her, but her bank account smelled just fine. Maddie even had a bit of a romantic rivalry, a dramatic one, naturally, involving a man named Cortez Thompson, another madam named Katie Fulton, and a duel, not between the men, but between the women. Supposedly, Maddie and Katie squared off with pistols. No one died, but the story lived forever. Historians still argue over whether it actually happened, but the tale fits the legend. And the legend, in a town where image was currency, was often more important than fact. Further north, in the dusty mining towns of the Dakota Territory, Dora Dufran had staked a name for herself as one of the West's most successful madams. She called her establishment Diddlin' Dora's, which tells you all you really need to know about her marketing sense and sense of humor. Dora didn't just ride into town and open up shop. She stayed, she adapted. When the mines dried up and Deadwood's fortunes shifted, Dora moved operations. Flexibility was key to survival, especially when half the town might catch fire or be arrested on any given Tuesday. She also knew the value of good PR. Dora claimed that Calamity Jane once worked for her, not as a lady of the night, but as a cook and cleaner. Whether that tidbit is true remains part of Wild West folklore, but again, in a world where very few people were fact-checking, a good story could double as free advertising. Not all women in these boomtowns were madams or dancers, though. Some ran laundries, boarding houses, or theaters. Others sold dry goods, hats, or remedies strong enough to burn a hole in your stomach lining. Female entrepreneurs weren't rare. They were essential. Men might have filled the mines, but women filled the infrastructure. And while the West loved to pretend it was governed by rugged individualism, the truth was nothing got done without someone making dinner and counting the receipts. Saloon girls, those often typecast as nothing but background dancers in fringe and eyeliner, were sometimes more savvy than they let on. Sure, some were performers and some were sex workers, but many were also quietly stashing coins under floorboards, buying property with stage names, and retiring to homes nicer than half the judges in town. Let's not forget, this was an era when a woman couldn't vote in most states, but could own a bar that decided who got drunk enough to do something regrettable, or something historic. The contradiction practically hummed like a fiddle tune at the end of a long night. These women created networks too. Word traveled about where work was good, where a sheriff looked the other way, and where a bad-tempered client had been shot for getting grabby. There are records of women pooling funds to buy each other out of jail, or sending money east to support siblings or aging parents. The sisterhood wasn't just symbolic, it was often literal. Inside these glittering gaslit parlors, power looked different. It wore silk where it could, sometimes ruffles, if the trunk hadn't been rained on. It smelled of perfume and pipe smoke, and it was hard-won, wrangled from crooked landlords, moody clients, and the near-constant threat of being run out of town on a rumor and a rail. Modern sensibilities might struggle with the moral math of profiting from pleasure, but it's worth remembering, options for women were scarce. Teaching paid little, and domestic service offered even less freedom. Walking into a boomtown with an eye toward business, no matter the kind, required a cocktail of bravery, calculation, and a willingness to wear too much rouge. And put simply, they made it work. In an age where women couldn't testify in court or open a bank account without a male co-signer, Maddie Silks gave thousands in loans and bought prime real estate. Dora Dufran weathered economic downturns, competitors, and puritanical reformers who believed the town was morally safer without her in it. They kept going anyway. People like to romanticize the Wild West as the land of second chances. But for these women, it wasn't just about a second chance. It was about building something lasting in a town that might not last the winter. These weren't just brothels. They were empires made from velvet and grit, from ledger books and whispered names. They were houses of business, refuge, and occasionally actual shenanigans. Sometimes the buildings were painted bright red. Sometimes they weren't. But that's where the whole red light district term comes from. A red kerosene lamp hung outside to signal who was open for business, which, if you think about it, is basically the neon open sign of the 19th century. Less flash, more flammable. So next time someone says the Old West was a man's world, maybe remind them, sure, men might have built the saloons, but women ran the register. The crowd stirred, murmuring with anticipation as the tent poles creaked overhead, fabric shifting in the late summer breeze. Dust curled up from boot heels and parasols, mixing with the warm smell of popcorn and horse sweat and something faintly metallic. Gunpowder, perhaps. All eyes fixed on a small figure stepping into the ring. She didn't look like much, barely 5 feet tall, wearing a crisp blouse, a modest skirt, and a stern expression that said she didn't have time for nonsense. Then she picked up the rifle. Annie Oakley wasn't just good with a gun. She was art. She was rhythm. She was the answer to the question, what if perfect aim wore a bow in her hair? Born Phoebe Ann Mosey in a weathered log cabin in rural Ohio, Annie learned to shoot as a child. Not for sport, but for supper. By her teens, she was selling game to hotels and restaurants. And not just squirrels and rabbits, mind you. She once took down a deer from such a distance that even the deer probably said, "Wait, really?" before it keeled over. Annie's aim was so legendary, she beat traveling marksman Frank Butler in a shooting match at the age of 15. A man twice her age, Butler was probably used to being the one handing out humble pie, not receiving an entire bakery's worth of it in public. But instead of sulking, he did something even more shocking. He married her. Relationship goals, circa 1882. Imagine meeting your future wife because she absolutely destroyed you at target practice. That's oddly romantic. Unlike some Wild West show performers who leaned into the drama of the outlaw myth, Annie cultivated something different: precision, poise, and a quiet confidence that made people lean forward just to catch the sound of her voice. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and toured the globe, astounding royals and everyday folks alike. Queen Victoria reportedly called her performance a delight. Kaiser Wilhelm thought it clever to volunteer for one of her signature tricks. She aimed and shot the ashes off the tip of a cigarette he held between his lips. Safely, we should add. Now, historians tend to argue about whether Annie actually had a chance to shoot the Kaiser again during World War I. Some say she offered, jokingly, to take the shot for real this time. Others say it's just a tall tale. But let's be honest. If anyone could have ended the war early with one well-placed bullet and a polite curtsy, it would have been Annie Oakley. Despite her fame, she never let go of her values. Annie refused to perform on Sundays. She made sure she got equal billing with male stars, even in Europe, where they weren't quite sure if American women were allowed to own luggage, let alone firearms. She advocated for women's rights, supported young girls' education, and trained hundreds of women in marksmanship during World War I. Because in her view, self-defense wasn't just an option, it was a right. Picture her in the ring, lifting the shotgun with a flourish. A glass ball sails in a high arc through the air. Population A puff of powder. The audience gasps, then another, and another. She hits them all, not a twitch in her stance, not a flicker of doubt. Sometimes she even shot a playing card edge on, slicing it in half, then peppered the halves with holes for good measure. You know, just in case that card was thinking of getting uppity. And she did it in style. While other sharpshooters strutted in fringe and spurs, Annie wore tailored skirts and velvet jackets. She was all Victorian trim, with a side of "don't test me." The spectacle wasn't just her aim, but her refusal to play the caricature. She wasn't pretending to be a man. She wasn't apologizing for being a woman. She was just Annie. But even legends face shadows. After a train accident forced her to leave the Wild West show, she didn't fade quietly. She recovered, toured in a different act, and kept shooting with the same jaw-dropping accuracy well into her 60s. She even designed a shooting manual and campaigned for soldiers to receive better training. Yes, she aged. No, her eyesight didn't seem to notice. She once said, "I ain't afraid to love a man. I ain't afraid to shoot him either." Which, granted, sounds like something you'd see on a bumper sticker next to a glittery cowgirl hat. But from Annie, it wasn't sass. It was boundary setting. It was frontier feminism with a smoking barrel. And yet, while she shot corks off bottles and snuffed out candles with bullets, the real challenge Annie posed wasn't against glass or gunpowder. It was against expectation. In an era when women were supposed to stay soft-spoken and still, Annie stood center stage, gun raised, eyes steady, saying, "Watch this." Some historians wonder what her life might have been if she'd been born a century later, maybe an Olympic medalist, or the face of a viral YouTube channel titled "Sharp Shooting with Aunt Annie." But really, her timing was perfect. She showed up just as audiences were forming ideas about what the Wild West meant, and quietly rewrote the script. She passed away in 1926, just days before her beloved Frank, a pair until the very end. Some say his heart broke after she died. Some say they planned it that way, like a final exit from the stage, hand in hand. As the sun sets over the prairie and the tent flaps sway in the wind, you can still imagine the sound, not the bang of a gun, but the silence that followed each shot, the awe, the rustle of the crowd, the whispered, "Did she really do that?" Yes, she really did. Martha Jane Canary didn't so much enter the Wild West as she crash-landed into it riding bareback, half sober, with a rifle in one hand and a bottle in the other. You probably know her by her more famous name, Calamity Jane, and yes, she earned it. Or made it up, or more likely, did both. Because the thing about Calamity is, she lived at the crossroads of myth and Monday morning hangovers. Her life was part adventure novel, part barroom tall tale, and entirely unforgettable. Born in Missouri in 1852, she was the kind of child who could probably outride a thunderstorm by age 9. After her family moved westward, she found herself an orphan before she was even fully grown. Because of course she did. Nothing in her life was ever easy or neat. From that moment on, Jane became a professional survivor. She took jobs hauling freight, working as a scout for the military, and reportedly once dressed as a man to sneak into the army. She claimed to have been a dispatch rider and sharpshooter under General George Custer. Whether that actually happened is, let's say, open to enthusiastic debate. But it sounds cooler than "I worked the telegraph desk" so who can blame her? She dressed in buckskins, shot better than most men, and was known for drinking anyone under the table, often literally. Jane didn't shy away from a fight or a bottle, or from storytelling that would make even a poker player raise an eyebrow. Her legend got so big, she was invited to perform on stage, narrating her wild tales with dramatic flair, and sometimes forgetting the plot halfway through, depending on how much she'd had to drink. Audience reviews were mixed, but nobody ever forgot her. One of the most enduring parts of Calamity Jane's myth is her supposed romance with Wild Bill Hickok, a gunslinger known for his luxurious hair and tendency to die dramatically in card games. Jane claimed she loved him, that they were married, and that she nursed him before his death. Historians, meanwhile, squint at the records and say, maybe. What's true is that she admired him deeply, followed him to Deadwood, and asked to be buried next to him, which she was. So whether or not they were sweethearts, she made sure they were roommates in the afterlife. Romantic or persistent, you decide. But Calamity wasn't just about the flair and gunpowder. During a smallpox outbreak in Deadwood, she reportedly worked as a nurse, fearlessly tending to quarantined men and earning respect as something more than a headline. It's one of those quieter chapters that gets overshadowed by shootouts and saloon brawls, but it showed the full range of her contradictions. Wild, yes, but capable of deep compassion. She lived in flophouses and cabins and eventually a tent in the Black Hills. Her possessions were few: a rifle, worn boots, a weathered hat, and enough stories to fill a saddlebag, and then some. She could curse like a miner, cradle a child, and vanish into the prairie before anyone could ask what was true and what wasn't. The truth is, the Wild West had no user manual, and Jane didn't ask for one. She forged a life out of grit and improvisation, snagging whatever opportunity galloped by. She didn't fit into any box society offered women at the time: homemaker, debutante, schoolmarm. Instead, she stomped across the stage of history in boots 2 sizes too big, trailing rumors, empty whiskey bottles, and a mountain of borrowed hats. She died in 1903, reportedly from pneumonia and poor living, but even her death isn't without dramatic flair. Some say she knew it was coming and asked for whiskey instead of medicine. Again, possibly true, possibly legend. With Jane, the difference doesn't really matter. The myth is part of the woman, and the woman helped write the myth. In today's world, Calamity Jane would be the kind of person who rides a motorcycle across the country, writes a memoir, and scares the host of every morning talk show, probably while wearing fringe and aviators. Back then, she was one of a kind. Not entirely outlaw, not exactly hero, a little bit nurse, a little bit nuisance, and a whole lot of frontier chaos. And if she fudged some details along the way, well, wouldn't you? The West was made for embellishment. And Jane, in all her filthy, stubborn, gunslinging glory, fit it like a glove. A very well-worn, possibly stolen glove. Some of the West's most enduring fortunes weren't panned from glittering creeks or blasted from rock. They were wrung from water buckets and stitched into seams, built in kitchens turned laundries, and parlors turned sewing rooms. Survival wasn't always about high noon showdowns or saloon brawls. It was often just about getting someone's pantaloons clean enough for Sunday. Take the laundress. To modern ears, maybe not the most glamorous title, but on the frontier, laundresses were the unsung heroines of hygiene and hustle. A good laundress could make more than a soldier, and she didn't need a revolver, just strong arms, boiling water, and the patience of a saint soaking a cavalryman's socks. Enter Biddy Mason. Born into slavery in Georgia in 1818, she was forced to walk behind a wagon train from Mississippi all the way to California, over 2,000 miles. That's like walking from New York to Denver and then deciding, you know what? I think I'll become a landowner now. Once in California, Biddy's story took a turn that Hollywood would call unrealistic if it weren't already true. California was a free state, so when her enslaver tried to drag her back south, she sued for her freedom and won. That wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. She worked as a midwife and laundress, saving her money dollar by dollar. No TikTok side hustles, no affiliate link magic, just linen, lye soap, and a whole lot of determination. Eventually, she bought land in what would become downtown Los Angeles. That land. It made her one of the wealthiest women in the city. But she didn't hoard it. She gave generously to causes that built the city's early black community. She funded schools, fed the hungry, and helped establish the city's first African Methodist Episcopal Church. And to think it started with buckets and blisters. Of course, not every laundress made it to the landowning phase. Most simply survived. And survival was no small thing. Washing clothes back then wasn't your weekend chore with scented detergent pods and soothing playlists. It was a full-body workout involving scalding water, washboards, and enough scrubbing to qualify as a martial art. And laundresses weren't just cleaning shirts. They were cleaning up lives. Soldiers relied on them during campaigns. Settlers depended on them to keep disease at bay. Because no one wants to die of dysentery just because their long johns weren't boiled. Then there were the seamstresses, wielding their needles like tiny swords of order against the chaos of the frontier. They transformed bolts of cloth into dignity, shirts, trousers, curtains, and the occasional wedding dress, because even in boom towns where half the buildings were tents, people still dreamed of tying the knot under some lace. Sewing, unlike gold panning, offered slightly more consistent returns and fewer chances of being robbed by a guy named Buckshot Ted. It was delicate work, detailed, and often done by candlelight after long days of cooking, cleaning, or raising children. Some women sewed for their families, others opened small shops or went door to door, measuring neighbors one hemline at a time. And in some dusty towns, a decent seamstress was in such demand that she could charge San Francisco prices with a grin and a pincushion. Bonanza towns had miners, but boom towns, they had tailors, many of them women, turning bolts of fabric into civilization. Ever tried breaking in a new saloon without someone sewing the curtains? Exactly, chaos. Of course, reality stitched in complications. Not everyone in a petticoat behind a sewing counter was a small business owner. Many were working off debts, or laboring in slightly disguised parlor houses where the sewing was sometimes just for show. The line between a seamstress, a performer, and a companion was flexible, like elastic, only that hadn't been invented yet. That's one of those facts historians sometimes debate: how many women claimed seamstress status to stay respectable in the records, even if their lives were more complicated. It's one of the reasons the word seamstress shows up on so many censuses. It covered a lot of ground: practical ground, emotional ground, economic ground. and sometimes plausible deniability. Still, many women genuinely lived by the needle. In San Francisco, Sacramento, and Salt Lake City, ads filled newspapers offering fine tailoring, button repair, and drapery by hand. These weren't side gigs. They were survival stitched into commerce. Some women even partnered with general stores, selling handmade garments on commission long before Etsy made it cool. And then, of course, there were the hidden stories. The ones you feel rather than read. A widow sewing to feed 5 mouths. A black woman laundering for the same family that once enslaved hers, now on her terms. A girl patching up work shirts for minors she barely knew, dreaming of a future where she'd sew for just herself. What's striking isn't how hard these women worked. It's that they worked despite everything. The odds, the laws, the terrain, the sheer weight of needing to be everything all at once. Clean, composed, skilled, fast, and polite. Preferably while boiling a kettle and deflecting unwanted attention with a glare sharp enough to slice thread. It's tempting to think of the Wild West as a place of myth and men with hats too big for their heads. But if you look closer, you'll notice that the myths were hemmed, pressed, and probably laundered by women. That shirt the sheriff's wearing in your favorite Western, a woman pressed it. That army tent, sewn by someone's wrinkled fingers. That wedding dress on the brave girl marrying a gold miner with questionable hygiene, you already know. So the next time you think of the Wild West, picture the steam rising from a kettle, the rhythmic slap of cloth on a washboard, the careful hum of a needle pulling through fabric. Picture fingers raw from lye soap and eyes blurred from threading needles by lamplight. Fortune wasn't always gold. Sometimes it was just getting paid on time. And Biddy Mason, she wasn't just laundering clothes. She was laundering fate, bleaching out the past and starching the future until it held its shape. Turns out, the backbone of the frontier may have worn an apron and knew exactly how to iron a collar sharp enough to command respect. They came west with trunks full of long skirts, chalk, slates, and the very firm belief that algebra could civilize anything. Down the dusty trails from Boston, Albany, or maybe even Cleveland, clattered the schoolmarms of the frontier, young women barely out of school themselves, stepping into one-room schoolhouses with more bravery than any gunslinger in town. They were the official agents of spelling and self-restraint, and they came to teach the alphabet to children who had only recently learned not to bite. Picture it, a single-room log building with cracks in the walls, wide enough to invite half the forest inside. Inside, it's too hot in August, too cold in March, and always somehow scented with livestock, pencil shavings, and yesterday's beans. The chalkboard is actually just a board. The eraser is a rag that used to be a shirt. And the teacher is a 19-year-old from Vermont, trying to explain silent ease, while a boy in the back shoots spitballs through a straw made from prairie grass. They weren't just teaching basic literacy. They were introducing a whole way of life, routine, clean fingernails. The idea that a comma in the wrong place might be the beginning of chaos. These women often arrived alone, or occasionally with a chaperonette who doubled as moral backup. Their students were the children of miners, farmers, outlaws, widows, gold dreamers, and occasionally a stray dog who wandered in and refused to leave. The attendance list changed with the seasons. Harvest time meant smaller classes, especially among older boys who were needed to haul, dig, or shoe. The pay? Practically theoretical. Most frontier teachers earned about $30 a month, and that's before you subtract room and board, often provided by one of the families whose children they taught, which meant that a teacher might spend her evenings bunked down in the same home as that kid who licked the chalk. There was truly no escape, not even at the dinner table. And yet, these women stayed, often for years. Some even married into the community, others moved on to another town, another school, each one a little more cracked and drafty than the last. The isolation was intense. Letters from home took weeks, if they arrived at all. Sundays were usually quiet, unless one was brave enough to attend church, where every pair of eyes turned to see what the new schoolma'am was wearing. There weren't many choices. It was the usual wool dress that somehow managed to be both itchy and hot, paired with boots that doubled as snowshoes and blister factories. Still, day after day, they stood at the front of the room and wrote the day's lessons on the board. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. Later came geography and American history, though those often arrived tangled in patriotic fervor and questionable maps. There's a story about a teacher in Kansas whose students, all under the age of 12, brought their own coal to heat the stove. If someone forgot, everyone shivered. If someone put in too much, the back row fell asleep in a hypnotic daze of warmth. Keeping order was part of the job, and not gently. Discipline ranged from stern glances to actual paddling, though many teachers found creative alternatives. One school teacher in Montana made students who cursed read Bible verses until their mouths felt scrubbed clean. Another simply made them write, "I will not lasso the chickens during science class," 100 times. Because yes, that had happened, twice. The schoolhouse was more than a place for children. It was the community's hub, the site for town meetings, dances, church services, and the occasional spelling bee so intense it could cause lifelong grudges. It was often the first public building erected after the saloon, or occasionally before. Priorities varied by town. And though these women were seen as agents of order and virtue, they were just as often targets of gossip. A schoolmarm who laughed too loud, wore a ribbon in her hair, or accepted a ride home from a gentleman might find her reputation reduced by breakfast. It was a strange double life. Respected in theory, scrutinized in practice, and always expected to remain single for as long as possible. Marriage often meant losing the job. A married teacher, apparently, was too distracted by wifing to teach fractions with proper focus. One disputed wrinkle in all this? Some historians argue that schoolmarms weren't quite the lone torchbearers of literacy on the frontier. In towns with diverse populations, including sizable Mexican, Native American, and Chinese communities, education took many forms, sometimes with older siblings or community elders doing the teaching. Not all roads to literacy were paved with a chalkboard and a bell, but those one-room schoolhouses did become a symbol of order, of permanence, of the belief that if your child could read Longfellow, they might not become an outlaw. It's also worth noting, despite the hardships, many of these women adored their students and were fiercely proud of their work. They kept journals, full of stories about muddy boots, surprising essays, and the joy when one kid finally read a whole sentence out loud without stopping. These were the small victories. They didn't get medals. They got ink-stained fingers and the occasional thank you pie. And while perhaps not as glamorous as sharpshooting or stagecoach robbing, their influence was arguably greater. By 1900, teacher training colleges, known as normal schools, were overflowing with women headed west. They were called schoolmarms and blue stockings. Some towns even offered cash bonuses to attract female teachers, knowing full well that a good one could lift a whole community, or at least convince the kids to stop throwing rocks when they got bored. So the next time you're bored in traffic, or trying to remember how to divide fractions, picture her. A young woman balancing a spelling book in one hand, a stick of chalk in the other, standing tall in a cold schoolroom while a rooster pecks at the doorway. She didn't come west for fame or treasure. She came to teach tiny humans how to leave better penmanship on fence posts, and somehow that changed everything. Farther west, where the mountains gave way to wind-blown towns and uncertain chances, there were women who carried not just the weight of survival, but the heaviness of being seen as something less, twice over. These were the black women who fled southern plantations, still bearing the echo of chains in their bones. The Hispanic women, whose families had lived on the land since before it was called the United States. And the Chinese women, brought in pairs and planeloads, well, shiploads, for labor or marriage or something even less clearly defined. They came with different languages, different customs, and very different expectations of what opportunity meant. But they all arrived at the same harsh truth. The West wasn't an open door for everyone. It creaked open for some, slammed shut for others, and occasionally just didn't exist at all. Let's start with Mary Ellen Pleasant. If you've never heard of her, don't feel bad. History has a habit of whispering about women like her when it mentions them at all. She was born into slavery in Georgia, but found her way to freedom and then to fortune. In San Francisco, she was a businesswoman, an abolitionist, and legend has it, maybe a little bit of a spy, which frankly just makes everything cooler. Mary Ellen amassed wealth through smart investments in boarding houses and laundries, practical businesses in a city flooded with lonely miners and not enough soap. She funded lawsuits and underground railroad efforts, slipping money to those trying to flee cruelty, all while wearing the cloak of a successful entrepreneur. Picture her walking the streets in a good coat, with quiet power in her eyes. Someone who knew things, who saw through things, and who survived them anyway. Not everyone liked her. Powerful white men accused her of witchcraft, whispered that she was meddling. To be fair, she was meddling in injustice, in systems, in the idea that poor black women couldn't change anything. And if throwing a little witchcraft into the mix kept everyone on their toes, more power to her. Now imagine you're a black woman crossing the plains, not as a spectacle in a dime novel, but as a laundress, a cook, maybe a healer. Maybe you've just escaped with your children and you're trying to make it to Kansas or Colorado. The wagon rocks back and forth, the land stretches out forever, and every town you pass looks at you like a problem. You're neither welcome nor invisible, and both facts hurt in their own way. In old photographs, you see these women standing tall, even when there's wind in their hair and dust on their skirts. They look like they could unmake you with one tired glance. They worked dawn to dusk and still found time to sing lullabies, patch up boots, and mutter prayers that sounded suspiciously like warnings. And then there were the women who were always there. Hispanic women whose great-grandparents had built adobe homes under the same sun, long before treaties redrew maps without permission. In places like New Mexico, Texas, and California, They weren't newcomers. The newcomers were the people who spoke English and invented paperwork. After 1848, when the U.S. gobbled up half of Mexico like a land-hungry toddler at a Thanksgiving table, those families were told, with remarkable arrogance, that their heritage had just changed sides. One day, they were citizens of Mexico. The next, they were foreigners in their own kitchens. Take a moment to imagine being told you're not from around here while standing on the same piece of land where your grandmother was born, gave birth, and probably yelled at a chicken or two. The real trick wasn't surviving the wilderness. It was surviving the paperwork. These women grew food, managed ranches, and negotiated in 2 languages, or 3 if you count the ones spoken through narrowed eyes and pursed lips. They wove traditions into the American tapestry, whether invited or not. Some became healers, blending Spanish, indigenous, and Catholic practices. Others ran dry goods stores and helped new arrivals figure out how not to die of thirst. Their Spanish lace became part of the West's wardrobe without the credit. Their recipes became authentic cuisine long before anyone paid $16 for enchiladas. Meanwhile, in railroad towns springing up like weeds along the tracks, Chinese women faced a different set of impossibilities. Let's debunk a quick myth. Most of the early Chinese immigration westward wasn't just gold fever, it was labor. Hard, endless, underpaid labor. Building railroads, mining, cooking. And the few Chinese women who made it across the ocean? Often they didn't have a choice about what they were coming for. Some were brought as wives, others as indentured laborers, and still others under darker, crueler arrangements. They were watched, judged, and often outlawed. The Page Act of 1875 specifically targeted Chinese women, assuming most were immoral before they ever stepped off the boat. That's right. America had a law that was basically, we don't know you, but we're pretty sure we disapprove. But those who made it stayed. They built lives anyway. Behind red paper doors and sweet-smelling kitchens, they raised children, took in boarders, and taught each other how to read. They started enterprises, small family businesses, temples, and herb shops. And they clung to beauty. Pearl earrings, silken chipaos, tiny altars glowing with incense. Yes, there was racism, mountains of it. But there was also dumpling soup on cold nights, whispered lullabies over soot-streaked cradles, and the quiet grace of women who knew how to hold on. We often picture the Wild West as a land of loud gunfights and louder hats. But out beyond the dust and the drama, there were women like Mary Ellen, Maria, and Mei Lin. Names we don't always hear, but who did the hardest thing of all? They endured. They sowed gardens beside outhouses, raised children between railroad blasts, and spoke truths in tongues the census didn't bother to count. Their resilience wasn't loud. It didn't shout or sparkle or ride horseback into legend. It was the kind you only notice when you stop to look, like the way prairie grass always grows back, no matter how many times it's trampled. And their strength? It didn't come from claiming the land. It came from surviving it, being ignored by it, and still calling it home. So the next time someone tries to sell you a heroic tale of the West, filled with poker chips, pistols, and perfectly tamed mustaches, remember the women behind all that, the ones who cooked for miners who wouldn't meet their eyes, who translated births and deaths across 3 languages, who stitched their lives together with thread that no one else could see. They weren't just surviving a harsh land, they were surviving the people in it. They didn't wear white coats. There were no stethoscopes dangling importantly from their necks, no diplomas framed on log cabin walls. But the women who served as healers and midwives on the frontier were about as close to a medical system as many folks in the Wild West ever got. And while they lacked everything from penicillin to patient charts, they had two things in abundance: grit and know-how, usually passed down from mothers, grandmothers, and the occasional talking herb garden. Their medicine cabinets weren't filled with bottles, but with pouches of dried yarrow, slippery elm bark, and willow, the pre-aspirin tree, nature's own painkiller. For fevers, there was elderflower tea, and for childbirth, well, let's just say women had to be both coach and cheer squad, often without the luxury of clean towels or even hot water. Frontier midwives were also expected to be calm under pressure, good with a knife when necessary, and uninterested in fainting at the sight of blood. Basically, they were the Swiss Army knives of the prairie. When someone got kicked by a mule, slid under a wagon wheel, or found themselves with a rattlesnake politely stuck to their leg, the healer showed up, not with anesthesia, but maybe with a poultice, a stiff drink, and the kind of confidence that said, "I've done worse in the dark." And sometimes they had, while also cooking dinner for 5 kids and shooing chickens off the porch. Midwives weren't just baby catchers, they were also grief bearers, cradle builders, and often the ones who had to issue the hardest truth a family would ever hear: that sometimes, even with everything, the baby, or the mother, would not survive. It's hard to romanticize childbirth when the outcome depended as much on luck and weather as it did on skill. And yet, these women persisted. Picture a one-room cabin, heat spilling from a kettle on the hearth, pain hanging in the air like smoke. A woman labors in the back bedroom, or more likely, just the corner, while her husband paces in circles big enough to wear grooves into the floor, occasionally trying to be useful and failing nobly. The midwife is there, sleeves rolled, hair back, whispering things like, "Breathe, you're strong," and "Tell that man to fetch more clean rags or go stand in the barn." In many communities, healers weren't just tolerated, they were treasured. That meant if the woman down the road knew how to keep down a fever with peppermint and knew just where to press to relieve a breech baby, her neighbors didn't care if she couldn't write her name. She was trusted, and that trust came with responsibility, sometimes too much of it. Because when a remedy failed or a wound worsened or a child didn't make it through the winter, it could turn quick. Whispers of witchery weren't entirely extinct in those parts. And yes, before you ask, there were disputes. One famous debate was over whether midwives should be allowed to use instruments like forceps. Some doctors, most of whom were men, and none too familiar with childbirth beyond textbooks, insisted that such tools were dangerous in untrained hands. Midwives who delivered hundreds of babies safely argued that what was dangerous was pretending birth could be tamed by a diploma. One documented midwife, a woman named Doc Susie Anderson, was one of the first licensed female physicians in Colorado. In her case, the doc wasn't honorary. She earned her medical degree in 1897, but most women didn't have that path open to them. They learned by doing. You could almost hear the prairie whisper, "Credentials optional, survival essential." Nursing wounds was another unglamorous reality of frontier life. A tumble from a horse, a misfired musket, even a simple blister turned septic. Injuries didn't need to be dramatic to be deadly. With no ER to visit and no antibiotics to be found, these women turned to whatever was on hand: honey to disinfect, onions for poultices, comfrey to stitch broken skin. Sometimes the cure was a scalding hot iron and a deep breath, for cauterizing, not for anyone's mood. And hygiene? Let's just say it was well-meaning. Water was often fetched from the same stream where horses bathed, babies splashed, and raccoons possibly plotted. Boiling it helped when time allowed. Otherwise, healing took place in cabins where flies had voting rights and hand washing was considered more a good suggestion than a rule. What's astonishing is the sheer volume of things these women just figured out. They practiced a blend of folk medicine, indigenous knowledge, and personal ingenuity. Herbal treatments used by Native American women, like blue cohosh to induce labor or echinacea for infections, slowly made their way into settler practices. The women learned from each other, and sometimes they learned the hard way. The Wild West may have been marketed as a man's world of cattle rustling and gunfights at high noon, but when a child was burning with fever, or your neighbor took a hatchet to the thigh by accident, it wasn't a gunslinger who walked in. It was someone's neighbor with a bottle of angelica root and a spine of steel. You could call them healers. You could call them midwives. Or just call them what they were: the quiet backbone of an entire frontier civilization that would have fallen apart 1,000 different ways without them. They made life possible, literally, one birth, one bandage, one breath at a time. And let's be honest, today we might panic at a paper cut, drive 20 minutes to urgent care, and feel heroic for having endured all 10 seconds of it. These women, meanwhile, were out here resetting broken bones with a stick, a belt, and the power of aggressive optimism. So the next time you take 2 Tylenol and call it bravery, just remember: someone's great-great-grandmother once dug out a bullet with a kitchen spoon and then made biscuits for dinner. Imagine the desert wind scraping across your face like a dry sponge, the sun making your ears feel like toast, and suddenly, there she is. Dust-covered hat, eyes squinting against the light, and a revolver tucked in a sash that probably also held a hairbrush. Pearl Hart, better known as the Lady Bandit, did not step quietly into infamy. No, she kicked the saloon doors open and made sure someone was nearby to write it all down. Pearl's story is one of those that sounds like it's been polished too many times, like a lucky coin rubbed smooth. Born in Canada and educated at a convent school, Pearl seemed destined for a perfectly respectable life involving embroidery and emotional repression. But the frontier had other plans. She ran away in her teens, possibly with a gambler, maybe with a snake oil salesman. Historians can't quite agree, and frankly, neither could Pearl, depending on when you asked her. By 1899, she'd cut off her hair, borrowed some pants, and staged one of the last stagecoach robberies in the American West. That's right. By the time Pearl tried her hand at banditry, the whole endeavor was basically vintage. The Wild West was winding down, but Pearl was just rolling up her sleeves. She and her partner Joe Boot, a man with a suspiciously noir-sounding name, held up a coach in Arizona. Their take? Around $400 and some personal belongings. Not exactly a retirement fund, but enough to make headlines. And Pearl, half Robin Hood, half main character energy, reportedly gave the passengers back a little money so they could make their way home. Even in crime, she was on brand. When she was caught, unsurprisingly, since escape plans are hard to execute from a mule cart, newspapers went wild. A woman in trousers with a gun. The public couldn't decide if they were scandalized or slightly in love. Her trial became a spectacle, and Pearl leaned into it like a seasoned influencer. She gave interviews, she posed for photographs, she reminded everyone that women, too, could be reckless and dramatic under a wide sky. As for her sentence, 5 years in prison. But she only served a portion of that before being pardoned, possibly because her presence at the Yuma Territorial Prison was more chaos than the guards had bargained for. Some rumors say she manipulated the warden. Others whisper she might have become pregnant in prison and was quietly released. Both stories are plausible and depend heavily on who's telling them and how much coffee they've had. And then she disappeared. In the years after her release, she wandered in and out of public record like a ghost in boots. Some say she joined a Wild West show. Others claim she lived out her years as a maid under an assumed name. Or maybe she became a rancher, or a teacher, or owned a tavern. The truth is, the trail runs cold, and that's weirdly perfect. Pearl Hart, the woman who robbed a stagecoach because she was desperate to get some money and see her mother, knew how to vanish when the story glittered brightest. Belle Starr, on the other hand, didn't just flirt with notoriety, she invited it in for supper and gave it a nickname. Born Myra Maybelle Shirley, in Missouri of all places, she was the kind of Southern belle who traded her corset for cartridges. There's an old photo of her in a velvet dress, pistol at her side, glaring like she just caught someone double-dipping the salsa. That's Belle. Elegant, armed, and done with your nonsense. Belle grew up during the disorienting years of the Civil War. Her family sympathized with the Confederacy, which nudged young Belle into some pretty shady company. Confederate guerrillas, outlaws, and men whose job titles involved words like rustle and smuggle. She eventually married Sam Starr, a full-time outlaw with Choctaw roots, and together they became a kind of Western power couple, sort of like Bonnie and Clyde, if Clyde wore a feathered hat and Bonnie made you address her as Madam. Belle was arrested multiple times, often for harboring criminals, or, as she put it, hosting dinner parties with very misunderstood guests. She had a knack for escaping real punishment and a bigger knack for plastering herself across penny novels and dime store tabloids. People couldn't get enough of the idea of a woman riding side saddle through Indian territory, doling out sass and bullets with equal precision. Of course, there's a little dispute over how wicked Belle Starr actually was. Some historians argue that she wasn't much more than an accessory to the crimes of her husbands and associates, that her legend grew thanks to sensational journalism and Belle's own flair for theatrics. But others say, no, this was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, navigating a man's world with a straight face, a sharp aim, and an even sharper tongue. Her death was just as mysterious as her life. In 1889, Belle was shot in the back while riding home. That's the non-controversial part. The embarrassing part is that she may have died from falling off her horse afterward and hitting her head on a rock. The real crime might have been the horse's coordination. Suspects included a disgruntled neighbor, her new husband, and even her own son. With no trial and no clear culprit, her murder remains unsolved. A final, dramatic, ellipsis at the end of a storied life. Belle's legacy is complicated. Some remember her as a trailblazing female outlaw. Others say she was more myth than menace. The truth probably lives somewhere in between, sipping black coffee and laughing into the desert wind. It's worth noting that these women weren't just breaking laws for funsize. Their lawlessness was often born of desperation, fierce independence, or a refusal to operate within a system that didn't offer them much. In a world that told women to keep quiet, they chose to make noise. It might have been the wrong kind, sure, but it echoed. And let's be honest, if you had to choose between folding laundry in a drafty homestead or galloping into infamy on a borrowed horse, singing outlaw ballads to yourself, well, it's not hard to see the appeal. So whether Pearl Hart was driven by drama or maternal guilt, and whether Belle Starr was a real outlaw or just real good at marketing, what's undeniable is how their stories linger, not just in history books, but in the language of rebellion. These women didn't ride into the sunset quietly. They raised dust, rattled the status quo, and dared the world to remember their names. Out west, under that big, aching sky where sagebrush stretches for miles and the stars don't bother with subtlety, something quietly revolutionary was happening before the rest of the country even had its morning coffee. Women were voting, not metaphorically or symbolically or in secret by passing notes tied to tumbleweeds. Nope. Real ballots, real polling places, real suffrage. It's easy to forget, especially when we're taught to think of the fight for women's rights as a street-marching, banner-waving, East Coast affair. But out in Wyoming Territory in 1869, women were given the right to vote. That's a full 50 years before the 19th Amendment would drag the rest of the country into something resembling progress. Wyoming did it first, and it didn't even flinch. Now, if you're wondering what kind of bureaucratic fever dream led to this, you're not alone. Some historians still debate whether it was a bold move for equality or just a strategy to attract more white women to a male-heavy frontier with the promise of political power and slightly less frequent proposals by men named Buckshot Larry. Either way, it stuck. And at the heart of this little democratic miracle was Esther Hobart Morris, a woman who might not have worn a cape, but certainly deserved one. Esther was the first woman to serve as a justice of the peace in the United States, appointed in 1870 in South Pass City, Wyoming. She was widowed, tough as a pine knot, and reportedly held court with a no-nonsense stare and a teacup that may or may not have had anything stronger than tea in it. Morris wasn't exactly trained in law. Most people weren't out there. But she was respected and famously decided cases with a mix of common sense, frontier practicality, and probably the occasional sigh at male foolishness. The story goes that she helped convince the Wyoming legislature to pass the suffrage bill, although, naturally, some folks debate just how influential she really was. Either way, she became a symbol, an upright figure in a bonnet, proving that civic life didn't require a beard or a cigar. Of course, Western suffrage wasn't built by one woman alone. The wide, unsettled territories gave women freedoms that Eastern cities hadn't even begun to imagine. In the hard, often lawless landscape, nobody cared whether you wore petticoats or pants. What mattered was whether you could ride, shoot, or keep a homestead from falling over in the wind. Women ran ranches, managed local businesses, and smuggled ideas about equality into dinner conversations over boiled beans. There was a strange, ragtag kind of democracy to it all. If a town needed a teacher, she got hired. If it needed a mayor, well, sometimes she got elected. One Montana town even ended up with an all-female city government in 1916. Voter turnout? Off the charts. Political backstabbing? Still present, but at least they did it in corsets and lace-up boots. Not that everything was dust, roses, and equal pay. Frontier women still struggled against deep-rooted patriarchies. Many Native American women had held leadership roles in their communities long before white settlers arrived, but now found themselves erased or treated as second-class citizens by the new structures of law. Meanwhile, immigrant women, Chinese, Mexican, and Black, were often denied these same rights that white women were beginning to claim. For every step forward, there was a stubborn boot heel digging in behind. Still, the suffrage movement in the West had momentum. Colorado gave women the vote in 1893, followed by Utah and Idaho. The idea spread across the mountains and plains like prairie fire, carried by determined women in wide-brimmed hats and stubborn shoes. They didn't burn bras. They hadn't even been invented yet, but they did write letters, organize rallies, and campaign by train and horseback. Imagine canvassing door to door when your neighborhood stretches across 80 miles and includes more cattle than people. Sometimes those meetings happened in parlors, and other times in barns, occasionally with proper tea service, and occasionally while wrangling chickens off the porch. But always with the same goal: to be heard, to vote, to be counted. One particularly memorable anecdote from the Wild West suffrage front involves a group of women riding into town on horseback, waving suffrage signs they'd nailed to broomsticks. Children cheered, men stared, and one very confused dog tried to join the parade. It wasn't polished, it wasn't grand, but it was real, and it worked. As the national movement gained traction, stories from the West became both inspiration and ammunition. Why not let women vote? Advocates would say. Wyoming hasn't exploded yet. And maybe that's the quiet genius of the frontier. It forced people to reimagine roles out of sheer necessity. There wasn't time for delicate sensibilities when your house needed a new roof, your neighbor's cow was stuck in a ditch, and the local judge had just left town to pan for gold. By the time the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920, women in the West had already been voting, governing, and rolling their eyes at sexist laws for decades. Wyoming, in fact, threatened to withhold statehood if it meant giving up women's suffrage. The federal government blinked first. And tucked away in a modest grave in Cheyenne lies Esther Hobart Morris, who lived to see her state become the first to elect a female governor. She's probably still shaking her head at all those years it took everyone else to catch up. So next time you fill out a ballot or scan your phone while waiting in line to vote, remember the women who did it first, on horseback, in dust storms, without emojis. The sagebrush may look quiet, but it remembers. They woke up with the sun because alarm clocks weren't invented yet, and neither were snooze buttons. Ranch women didn't get leisurely mornings with a cup of herbal tea and a 10-minute guided meditation. No, it was more like, open your eyes, hear a coyote howl, and remember you left the chicken coop open again. These women, ranchers, cowgirls, and fence menders, were the invisible machinery behind the machinery of the Old West. Morning chores weren't optional. Chickens needed feeding, cows needed milking, and that one mule had probably escaped again just to spite them. The Wild West might conjure images of rugged men silhouetted against horizon sunsets, but out on the range, women were just as tough and often less likely to accidentally shoot themselves cleaning a rifle. Take Lucille Mulhall. She wasn't just a cowgirl. She was the cowgirl. Born in 1885 in Oklahoma Territory, Lucille could rope, ride, and wrangle just as well as any man, and frequently better. She was so skilled, in fact, that Teddy Roosevelt allegedly called her the nation's first cowgirl, which is both an honor and something you'd expect to read on a novelty mug in a gift shop next to the jerky. By the age of 14, Lucille was performing in Wild West shows, dazzling crowds by roping wild steers in record time, with a hairdo that probably had to compete with the wind, dust, and the occasional flirtatious horse. She even beat male competitors at events like steer roping, which probably kept local egos bruised for decades. You can just imagine some grizzled ranch hand muttering into his mustache, "Well, sure she won, but I was distracted by my spurs." Now, not every ranch woman was in the limelight. Most weren't. Their work often ran quietly in the background, like a kind of dusty, denim-wrapped magic. These women ran homesteads while their husbands traveled for work, or didn't come back at all. They fixed fences, branded cattle, traded goods, and kept records, often with a baby on one hip and a shotgun within reach. Between managing livestock and managing everyone's tempers, it's no wonder they were considered the backbone of frontier life. And possibly the only reason dinner ever happened. The phrase homesteading might sound peaceful now, like something you'd do in a hobby farm with kombucha and a rooster named Steve. Back then, it involved clearing land, surviving droughts, and baking bread in ovens that doubled as space heaters. Water had to be retrieved from wells or creeks, which meant no quick showers, just a bucket and a prayer. Laundry was a full-day ordeal, and if a cow escaped in the middle of it, well, tough. The cow took priority, so you rolled up your sleeves and chased it in a petticoat across the prairie, while your biscuits probably burned. But here's the wildest part. They loved their horses. Horses weren't just tools of mobility. They were companions, co-workers, and occasional therapists. A good horse could mean the difference between making it into town or not, herding cattle or losing them to the hills, arriving inspired or arriving hungry and sunburned, with one boot missing. Lucille had her favorite horse, Governor, and she once said she'd rather ride him than go to a ball. Honestly, same. Lucille wasn't alone in blurring the lines between feminine and formidable. Women like Fanny Sperry Steele and Prairie Rose Henderson competed in rodeos in the early 1900s, dressed in scandalously practical split skirts, riding broncos with expressions that said, "Yes, I just did that." And yes, some people did faint at the sight of a woman wearing pants. The struggle was real and laced, and by the time Wild West shows took off in earnest, cowgirls had become a genre of their own. They were part athlete, part actor, part myth, and all dust. Their performances were breathtaking, but not just for the crowd, often for the horse too. Trick riding included standing upright on a galloping steed, jumping from one side to the other, or hanging off the saddle with one arm and pure audacity. Today, we might call it extreme sports. Back then, it was just Tuesday. There's some debate over who was actually the first real cowgirl. Some historians argue that there were dozens of unknown women doing the job before Lucille ever got her spotlight. They just didn't have promoters or men with mustaches writing articles about them. That's the thing about history. Sometimes the loudest stories come from those with the fanciest boots. But whether they were documented or not, these women were there. They're in the photographs with calloused hands and no-frills hats. They're in the journals and the letters, lamenting drought and celebrating the birth of a stubborn calf. They're the names etched lightly into barn rafters, often next to the date and a crude sketch of a horse. They were tough. They were graceful when they had the time, and most of all, they didn't ask permission. The work didn't stop when the sun went down, either. Fires had to be built. Meals needed cooking, usually involving beans, more beans, and a suspicious lump that might have once been a potato. Stories were told around the table, stories of prairie fires, of haunted canyons, of cattle drives gone sideways. The occasional snake under the floorboards, the occasional suitor who wandered off after realizing courting involved mending barbed wire. And in all of this, amid the calluses, the heat, and the hail, there was pride. Not pride in some glamorous, poster-worthy way, but quiet pride. In surviving, in building, in being just a bit tougher than yesterday. So the next time you picture the Old West, tilt your imaginary hat to the women who rode in those wide, sun-cracked saddles. The ones who mended fences and tied their hair back with whatever wasn't on fire. The ones who made it work, whether anyone was watching or not. Cowboys might have gotten the songs, but cowgirls wrote the lyrics when no one was looking. The wind on the prairie had a way of sounding like voices, especially late at night, around the fire, when everyone had stopped talking and the coffee had gone cold. Women on the trail used to say they could hear laughter on the wind, or sobs. Or maybe it was just the memory of someone they'd buried 100 miles back, still clinging to the canvas of their thoughts. Traveling west in the 1800s wasn't a grand road trip with snacks and playlists. It was a months-long gamble on wheels, weather, and the human body. And unfortunately, the body didn't always hold up its end of the agreement. Dysentery was the unofficial mascot of the Oregon Trail, and cholera was its cruel sidekick. Families would set out together with high hopes and too many canned peaches, and by the time they reached the Rockies, they'd be carrying more memories than people. Children were often the first to go. A bad sip of water, a fever under the unforgiving sun, and suddenly the little shoes in the wagon stayed empty. Graves were shallow things, dug quickly, covered with rocks to keep out scavengers, and marked with whatever was handy: a stick, a bonnet, a scrap of ribbon. Women buried their babies with their own hands, every shovelful of dirt sealing away a piece of themselves. It wasn't just illness. Accidents came in forms you wouldn't think to fear today. A broken wagon wheel on a steep hill could turn into a funeral. Crossing a swollen river didn't just mean wet boots. It meant possibly watching your husband get swept away in a flash current, gone before you could even scream his name. And childbirth, ever the equalizer, didn't care if you were in a feather bed or on the floor of a covered wagon. The West was littered with stories of women giving birth alone, with nothing but a belt to bite and a prayer to mutter, hoping the next sound wouldn't be silence. But here's the thing. Frontier women didn't just survive, they carried on. They learned to wrap their grief in blankets and continue walking because there was no other option. If your child died on Monday, you still had to make biscuits on Tuesday. The oxen weren't going to harness themselves. Over time, sorrow hardened into strength. Not the flashy Hollywood kind, but the quiet, durable variety. The kind that doesn't need a speech or a theme song. It just gets up and milks the cow. Women formed unlikely communities along the trail, forged through shared loss. One woman might help another through childbirth, even if she didn't speak her language. A stranger might offer up herbs for fever, or hold your hand while you wept under the wagon, pretending not to cry herself. Grief was the common currency, and they traded it generously. They stitched together networks the way they stitched up torn garments, thread by thread. When your hands had nothing to do, they sewed, knitted, wrote in journals if ink hadn't run dry. It was a kind of rebellion, creating beauty in a world that kept trying to take it away. They swapped recipes for cornbread and cures for coughs. Secrets, too, like where to find the softest grass to lay a baby down, or which plants could quiet pain without killing the patient. Some of that knowledge came from indigenous women who shared remedies, sometimes in gratitude, sometimes for barter, sometimes just out of fierce, inexplicable humanity. Of course, later, much of that wisdom would be misunderstood, miscredited, or worse, punished by settler medicine men with degrees and egos. One documented piece of frontier wisdom was to boil willow bark for pain. It turns out willow bark contains salicin, a chemical cousin to aspirin. So yes, your great-great-grandmother might have been microdosing Tylenol with tree tea while giving birth in a thunderstorm. Respect. Of course, not all memories agree on the specifics. Some letters talk about women embracing life on the trail, finding spiritual clarity beneath the open sky. Others describe pallid despair, days blurring into a gray smear of hunger and wind. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, with a dash of exaggeration and a generous pour of hindsight. Women kept journals when paper allowed. In them, they'd write about the weather, the distance traveled, and maybe, just maybe, the ache behind their ribs they didn't dare speak aloud. It was safer to write, "John is still coughing," than to write, "I am afraid of becoming alone." Words were rationed like biscuits. Every woman on the trail had a scar, some literal. Burns from cooking over open flame, blisters turned to calluses, childbirth stitches done with unwashed hands. Some scars were quiet, unfelt, until a song played or a cloud passed the wrong way, and suddenly they were back in Kansas, holding a fevered infant and bargaining with a god who no longer wrote back. There's one account of a woman who, after losing 3 children in a single year, opened a school in her sod house. Not because she had formal training, but because she needed purpose, and so did the other children. Her schoolhouse had no blackboard, but she taught them songs and spelling, and how to hold a pencil without poking your neighbor's eye. She saved a town from despair by reminding them their children could still learn, even if their toys were pebbles and their desks were dirt. Resilience back then wasn't a buzzword. It wasn't something you crocheted onto a throw pillow. It was how you got through breakfast. It was how you got shoes on the kids and gathered firewood before the wind turned mean. It was how you looked at the spot where you buried your sister and said, "Let's keep moving." And if you've ever stubbed your toe and canceled your whole day, just take a moment to appreciate this legacy. These women powered forward with infections, grief, and pants made out of curtains. The West was not just won, it was endured. And women were the ones who endured it, not with cowboy hats and duels at high noon, but with cracked hands, silent strength, and the kind of courage that doesn't ask for applause. And somewhere, out there on the plains, under a sky so blindingly blue it looked like it could wash you clean, they laid their losses to rest and kept walking. Because there was still dinner to cook. The wind hasn't stopped blowing since Pearl Heart vanished into the tall grass, and maybe it never will. Out on the prairie, stories don't die. They just get quieter, traded from breeze to breeze like secrets too wild to settle. The cabins are gone, the hitching posts toppled, and the bonnets that braved sun and dust and judgment have long since crumbled back into earth. But the women, their mark is still here, not flashy, not always recognized, but permanent, like the ghost of a boot print in hardened mud. You see it in the laws that quietly shifted over the years, often under pressure from the soft but insistent voices of those who'd had enough. In Wyoming, for instance, women got the vote in 1869, 20 years before statehood, like the territory was saying, sure, we've got tumbleweeds and rattlesnakes, but we also respect your right to complain legally. Mainstream history often notes that Wyoming was the first U.S. territory to grant women suffrage. But what's debated is, why? Some say it was a progressive gesture. Others think lawmakers hoped to attract more women to the mostly male territory, like a grim dating app with voting rights attached. But the communities, those were built by women who didn't have the luxury of slogans or lecterns. They built schools out of scrap lumber and stubbornness. They taught kids by lamplight and baked bread when all they had were beans. They nursed neighbors through fevers and childbirth and heartbreak. They held funerals and barn dances with the same capable hands, because both required good pie and somebody to play fiddle. And they did it all while wearing corsets that could probably be used to lift small livestock. Even in their absence, their fingerprints remain smudged into dusty town charters, stitched into quilts passed hand to hand, carved into the warped pews of sun-bleached churches. This was a place where survival required cooperation, and guess who kept the wheels from falling off the wagon? Or literally put the wheels back on when the axle snapped in the middle of nowhere, and everyone was too busy panicking to notice the women already jacking up the wagon and cussing politely. There's something tender and terrifying about that kind of strength. Not the kind you measure in shootouts or whiskey shots, but the kind built from repetition. Carrying water, hauling wood, standing up when the world told you to sit down and smile pretty. Holding families together like battered patchwork, even when the seams frayed and the dust got in the corners of everything. Some women, like Mary Fields, Stagecoach Mary, left behind visible tracks. She carried mail through Montana snowstorms, armed with a rifle and an iron will. Others, like the unnamed midwives and medicine women, left behind something more sacred, lives safely delivered, wisdom quietly passed down, resilience stitched into the rhythm of daily life. The Wild West didn't tame these women. It met them and blinked, uncertain. They embodied independence in a way that wasn't showy, but unshakable. And maybe that's the kind that lasts. Independent not just in riding off alone into the horizon, but in getting up every day to face the rawness of a world where everything was broken in, horses, land, skin, but nothing was guaranteed. Not safety, not survival, not even softness. So they made their own comfort where they could. among each other. In stories retold around campfires, in lullabies sung over creaky cradles, in gossip that doubled as survival tips, they laughed, they joked, probably more than history gives them credit for. You try churning butter in August without making at least one off-color pun. And perhaps the biggest joke of all? That they were called pioneers, as if they were following someone else's path, instead of blazing one themselves, while society politely looked the other way, until it was too late to take their names off the mailbox. Even now, when you drive through the flat stretches of prairie, where ghost towns flicker behind tumbleweeds, and old railroad ties sleep under wildflowers, you might feel them. Not haunting exactly, just observing. Just making sure we remember that manifest destiny didn't just belong to men with muskets and maps. It belonged to women with calloused hands and unsent letters, and every reason to give up. But somehow, they didn't. They baked cakes for funerals and sang at weddings, and sometimes did both in the same dress. They built homes with no blueprints, dug gardens into dirt that didn't want to grow anything but rocks, and kept going long after the storybooks were closed. Their legacy is quieter than gunfire, but harder to erase. And if you ever feel like you're not doing enough with your day, just remember, some of these women gave birth in covered wagons and then finished driving the team because no one else knew how. The West didn't civilize these women. They civilized it, whether it asked for it or not. Their bones may be dust beneath sage and stone. Their laughter dissolved into the dry air. But their strength? It settled in, deep, laced into the land like old roots, impossible to pull up, whispering still, if you're quiet enough to listen. So the next time you squint at a Western and wonder where all the women are, just know they were always there. Not center stage, maybe, but without them, the curtain never would have gone up.